The Laundry is proudly produced by Strise, the AML automation cloud.
Sanctions are, of course, a political tool to any US administration, but perhaps more so for Trump. Everything that he does foreign policy-wise is around a deal, the art of the deal, right? So using sanctions as a leverage tool to achieve his foreign policy aims. And the US has always done that, but I think it's going to be even starker and even more brash than what we've seen before.
Welcome to The Laundry, the podcast connecting AML, compliance, and financial crime to the real world. Since the 2022 invasion of Ukraine, sanctions have become more than just a topic for compliance professionals, law enforcement, and regulators. They're now a buzzword on the lips of politicians, activists, terror organizations, and the global public.
I live in the most sanctioned country in the world. There are more sanctions here than in North Korea, Syria, and Iran summed up.
This morning in an interview with the Wall Street Journal, Vice President J.D. Vance says the U.S. would hit Russia with sanctions and potentially military action if a deal to end the war in Ukraine does not guarantee Ukraine's long-term independence.
The big thing to note here is that they are getting very targeted by specifying that any drone technology cannot be exported from the EU to Russia or to any country suspected of supplying Russia with drone technology.
Day after day, week after week, sanctioned goods are still flowing into Russia. We know, we saw it and filmed it ourselves in Georgia as British-made Range Rovers passed into the country this way.
What Putin could get from negotiations, he can just lifting sanctions. That's what he wants to do. Taken out of isolation and to have two presidents just deciding everything in the world.
Roman Abramovich, he was forced to sell Chelsea, not allowed in to the UK. The EU have now downgraded the sanctions on Roman Abramovich, deemed it that he did not benefit from Russia and from the war, and that has left a hugely bitter taste in the mouth of Chelsea fans.
How many fines have there actually been since the imposition of these sanctions? The short answer is 6. There have been 6 fines.
When I read the news, it feels almost scary to live in Russia. The reality is that if you're an average Russian, if you're not a politician, it does not feel so terrible to live in Russia. I guess many people don't understand how sanctions work.
We are possibly in the most intense sanctions climate ever in terms of packages and implementation. But it can't go on forever, can it? I'm your host Marit, CEO of Strise, and in this episode we're asking, will sanctions hit their peak in 2025? We will be discussing the biggest challenges in terms of implementation and regulation, the impact of a Donald Trump presidency on the entire space, and what are the panel's spiciest predictions for 2025. To dive into this topic, I'm here with my colleague Robin Laika, Solutions Architect at Strise and a Laundry co-host, Emil Dall, Head of Sanctions at FINTRAIL, and Nicole López del Carril, Principal Compliance Officer, 2nd LOD Sanctions Advisory at Danske Bank. And our lovely community audience, welcome to The Laundry, all of you. Robin, can you briefly remind our audience about you and your title as Sanctions Man at Strise?
Yes. Thank you for having me. A pleasure to join as always. Sanctions Man is sort of my alter ego where I take on my nerdiest hat and delve deeply into the rabbit hole of sanctions and Russian oligarch ownership and that kind of the top level nerd stuff that I like to do. So that's my Sanctions Man alter ego.
And welcome back to you, Emil. We did a podcast a year ago in London, which was like a live in-person podcast, but it's very cool to have you back at our first digital community podcast. So what should our audience know about you and your shiny new job title at FINTRAIL?
Yeah, it's great to be back. Although this time I think we're missing a bar. There was a bar last time, which I'm missing this time. I think my new job title at FINTRAIL really reflects the surge in demand that we've seen for firms to improve their sanctions capabilities. We've had a few significant fines. We've had years of kind of regulatory focus on sanctions, particularly in the UK and the EU. And it's really caused fintechs wanting to evaluate their sanctions and screening program. So that's kind of the experience we're seeing at FINTRAIL at the moment.
And Nicole, welcome to you. Welcome to the laundry. What should our audience know about you and your role at Danske Bank?
Thank you so much for having me, and it's great to be here for the first time. So I'm an intelligence and AML nerd by trade, and I have only recently delved into the sanctions space. I specialize in proactive data-led investigations in financial crime overall, and now kind of lending this expertise to the sanction circumvention space specifically. So I guess you can call me the anti-circumvention queen if we have the sanctions man in the room.
I love it.
And to a community audience, I won't get you all to introduce yourself, but thank you so much for being here digitally. We got a Q&A section at the end of the episode, so get thinking about your questions and use the Q&A function to submit your questions throughout the recording. And please also use the emoji reactions throughout. But okay, let's dive into the discussion. So Nicole, you're from the largest institution here. I just want to start with, what is it that you guys talk about and when it comes to sanctions around the coffee machine and the water cooler? What's the talk of the town in Danske Bank these days?
Definitely the talk of the town is circumvention. And I think that's what we'll probably highlight quite a lot in this conversation today. Regulations have been ramping up, enforcement is ramping up, but financial institutions and businesses are still really struggling to keep up. And I think Emil just noted that as well, as to why you guys have this focus now at FINTRAIL. The focus is really shifting from just screening names to stopping the flow of high priority goods and funds. And this means that we need more intelligence sharing, better detection of networks, and kind of this growing overlap between AML and sanctions compliance. It's an ongoing discussion between us and the regulators and other financial institutions, and really with businesses, especially small and medium businesses who are at the forefront of the impact of a lot of these sanctions when it comes to the West.
If we start by looking at Russia, we can't avoid talking about Russia when it comes to sanctions and just how the sanction packages keep rolling. In December, the EU adopted its 15th sanction package against Russia. And in January, the US Department of the Treasury introduced 3 new sets of sanctions measures aimed at penalizing Russia sanctions evasions. Emil, I don't know, but maybe you want to say something about what does it mean that we still see all these new sanction packages coming?
Yeah, I mean, following on from what Nicole just talked about, the theme of the day right now is all about circumvention, right? And sanctions are only effective if you're willing to maintain them over time. So as Russia's sanctions evasion efforts have evolved over the last 2 or 3 years, we've seen increasing the sanctions packages that are coming out now are a lot more about maintenance. So designating new networks related to sanctions evasion efforts. We've seen Operation Destabilize in the UK recently, which had sort of accompanying sanctions designations from OFAC, which was all about kind of shutting down a network used by Russia to evade financial sanctions. And we see continuing kind of designation of companies and banks and individuals outside of Russia for their role in sanctions evasion. So the sanctions packages we're seeing at the moment is exactly what Nicole was saying. It's about maintenance, it's about countering evasion of sanctions, and they're really only effective if you're willing to maintain them over time.
Robin, you and I did an episode where we asked ChatGPT to teach us how to evade sanctions. And I mean, the story got picked up by CNN and several outlets, and it was surprisingly easy to get ChatGPT to teach us how to avoid sanctions. And it did start recommending, here's some networks I can put you in contact with. And it was extremely helpful in trying to, in circumvention.
Yeah. And I think an interesting aspect is how we're seeing these enablers more and more being hit by sanctions as well. We've seen several of these Cypriot entities, secretary and fiduciary services, all of these adjacent services that are now being hit by sanctions as well. And it's enforcing this whole new intelligence theme into how the regulated entities are dealing with sanctions as well. It's not only a screening exercise, it's an intelligence exercise.
Maybe you, Nicole, maybe you have some insights you could share with the community on how you guys think about this intelligence piece that you mentioned in the beginning, like how you guys go about it and how you're able to go from just screening to intelligence to avoid circumvention.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, as Robin was mentioning, traditional tools like list screening are just no longer enough, and compliance teams must really integrate intelligence-led methodologies and a lot of things that are coming from the AML space actually into the sanctions world. I think this is quite interesting. Sanctions kind of traditionally was very black and white, right? I mean, there was a little bit of gray with some circumvention attention, in Iran and with Iran and Cuba and North Korea, but I think it's expanded into a whole industry of its own. I like to say that sanctions evasion is the lucrative business in money laundering today. I mean, the Russian government said that like a third of its imports were through non-official methods in 2023. So, that's billions of dollars worth of goods that are making it into Russia. How do we identify this within financial institutions? This is going to be much more focused on your regular AML controls, ongoing due diligence, event-driven reviews. And a lot of the things that we're seeing are very akin and very familiar to AML professionals, shell companies, nominee directors, obscure ownership, complex structures in third countries to launder goods, obfuscation of end users who disguise and ultimately receive dual use or high priority goods into the Russian market.
And I was just really curious if you had any examples of circumventions that you've clever circumventions that you've seen, if you have any examples.
I'm going to make a radical comment, which is that they're not that crazy looking. It's really third countries, transshipment points that are facilitating a mass amount of goods going into Russia. And what we really are trying to focus on is common high priority items, dual use goods, things that are going directly into the Russian war machine and that are then being seen on the Ukrainian battlefield. And that's where we just need to focus. And that comes from the financial institutions, but also from business and industry. We need upskilling in business and industry in order to really understand how their goods are misappropriated and misused. I mean, things as simple as, different types of chips that are in different electronic equipment, microwaves, refrigerators, to things like computers, which obviously have, very dual use purpose, and telecommunication equipment. We really need business and industry to be kind of upskilling and understanding the risks that they are engaged in third countries, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan. I mean, the list goes on. It's not even just the stands. It's also in a lot of countries around the world that you wouldn't necessarily expect, but who are facilitating this kind of invasion.
Is that the same that you are seeing working with your clients, Emil?
Yeah, and I mean, there's often this misconception, I think, that, okay, so we're talking about exports and goods being shipped to Russia that shouldn't be shipped to Russia. And from a financial institution perspective, you might be thinking, okay, well, that's kind of down to the exporter. They're the ones who are getting in trouble. But we're also seeing this increased focus from the regulators that financial institutions actually have quite a significant role to play here. So recently, the FAQ section by the EU Commission was updated to kind of make it clear that financial institutions do have a responsibility to ensure that they screen things like goods going into Russia. We've got in the UK, we've got the Office of Trade Sanctions Implementation, which is all about establishing reporting obligations for financial institutions who suspect that their clients are involved in trade sanctions circumvention. So it's not just about whether someone is exporting goods, it's also about the financial flows, and financial institutions actually have a huge role to play here. And that intelligence that the financial institutions suddenly have to play is all about, they need to understand who their clients are and what they have been trading in. Have they had historical trades through to Russia that suddenly stopped in 2022 and now suddenly they are exporting a lot to Kazakhstan? Like, that's a really obvious typology that financial institutions might want to pick up on and look through their client book and see if they have those kind of shifts in financial payment patterns and things like that. So there is really quite an expectation on firms to do their part here. And whether you like it or not, that's the regulatory expectation at the moment. It's not just about financial sanctions, it's also about trade sanctions when it comes to what financial institutions must do.
If you and Nicole were to kind of design the whole intelligence, data sharing, what would an ideal situation be for you if you think about, especially data sharing, shared intelligence among financial institutions to effectively combat this?
I think for me, one of the things that we really need to be focusing on is standardization, harmonization across the different markets, especially within the EU. I think the SATF did this quite successfully with AML, and there needs to be kind of a focus on that in sanctions in order to be able to create the framework for better intelligence sharing. I think it's also a regulatory focus away from just punitive measures. We do need enforcement action in order to point to it for businesses, but we also need preventative action. And the preventative action needs to be kind of collective at the EU level. One of the ways that I'm very hopeful that this might occur, I think it's still a little bit unknown, is through the new EU Anti-Money Laundering Authority, through AMLA. One of its goals is to unite financial intelligence units across the EU to really start looking at these types of intelligence sharing and information sharing across the EU. We already know that sanctions circumvention is cross-border. It's very complex. It's very complex for local police departments to really deal with. And I think we do need to elevate it to that kind of EU level in order to be able to address it appropriately. And also to have data scientists, complex investigation professionals, AML, financial crime specialists, and your traditional sanctions specialists working on teams together. And, we kind of need to expand what it means to be compliant in the sanctions space and really focus on this.
Yeah. Well, as also was mentioned in the beginning, that, sanctions become almost like an industry in itself. It's just really, it's a huge field. How do you get your teams to keep being motivated at this huge task? It's just new things coming, new packages. Name screening doesn't, we're moving on to intelligence. There's just so much work. Are really teams showing up with energy in the morning, really eager to fight this, or are we fatigued?
I mean, I think people who work in sanctions are often quite excited by the topic because it's the one, it's more than other types of financial crime, perhaps. It's more closely linked to geopolitical events. So not just outside of Russia, but when elections are contested in Venezuela, you see an immediate response in the form of sanctions being deployed or new restrictions, or with the fall of the Assad regime in Syria, you see efforts to kind of lift sanctions and provide humanitarian payment channels and things like that. So it's a topic that's intrinsically linked to geopolitics, and I think that excites a lot of people. And then there's also, when you kind of take away from that, the more restrictions we have in place on sanctions, the more innovative you can also be about the controls that you're deciding to implement that, right? So a lot of firms found after Russia sanctions came into really ramped up after 2022, they saw that they had a lot of false positives, and they were spending hours and hours and hours and hiring more and more analysts to simply resolve quite simple false positives. So does this name match this name? No, it does not. So let's move on to the next case. And that's not a very good use of time. So actually, a lot of firms now are becoming smarter about how they design their screening systems, tuning and calibrating their screening systems to make it unique to their sanctions risk exposure, trying to really focus in on where the sanctions risk is, deploying innovative new controls to detect things like whether products are being used in restricted territories in Ukraine and all of that stuff. So when you kind of think about it, yes, it's a lot, but also it's quite innovative. It's an area of constant change, and I can imagine that's quite exciting. When I worked in industry before joining FINTRAIL, no day was the same, and that was quite exciting part of sanctions. And you really feel that you have a part to play, and you play quite a significant role in kind of the geopolitics of the day, and you have a stake in it, which is quite cool.
How's your team feeling at the Danske Bank, Nicole?
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with Emil. There's definitely a sense of being a little bit overwhelmed, I'm not going to lie, but I think that was probably more so at the beginning of a lot of these the sanctions packages and just the immense kind of paradigm shift that was the invasion of Ukraine. I think today there's a lot of creativity, as Emil was saying. within the sanction space, which is kind of an interesting topic because of it in and of itself, because sanctions before was very, focused on what does the legislation say? Is this sanctioned? Is this not? Is this on a list? Is this not? And I think right now we're working towards leveraging better data, technology, analytics, and just being able to be more creative in that space. As someone who's very passionate about these things, being able to bring it into the sanction space is quite new. And I think that's very exciting. And it's exciting to a lot of people in the sanction space. Some of the skills that we're trying to encourage people to gain, I think there's a lot of the sanctions professional world that needs to upskill in export controls, for example. I think that's a topic that is on everyone's lips these days. Also, the ability to analyze vast amounts of financial and trade data is very crucial to identifying circumvention patterns, and also using AI. I mean, at the end of the day, a lot of circumvention is not about identifying if something's on a list. It's about what is the narrative? What is the storyline here? Does it make sense? Does this good going to Kazakhstan, make sense? Is there an end user in Kazakhstan that makes sense? And that's where AI and large language models actually can play a pretty good role in supporting the investigator and supporting analysis, asking questions, if it's prompted correctly, asking questions to the investigator, and really augmenting human investigations by identifying inconsistencies and patterns. So I think there's a lot of creativity in this space, within the confines of sanctions, of course, but creativity that's very exciting.
I like that. I also think there's a lot of creativity in it. But let's move on to looking ahead outside Russia, Ukraine, and maybe a little bit of predicting the future. And we can't start predicting without looking at Donald Trump and what impact his presidency will have. So the Atlantic Council says sanctions are poised to remain a cornerstone of U.S. foreign policy under a second Trump administration. Trump says himself that he would sanction Russia if Putin does not negotiate on Ukraine. He also lifted sanctions aimed at curbing Israeli settler violence against Palestinians in the West Bank, and he also rescinded a policy that had blocked sanctions against the International Criminal Court. So, does the Trump presidency mean that we are unlikely to reach peak sanctions in the next 4 years? Is there anyone who has a spicy take on that?
I'm not sure it's a spicy take, but I think what we can take so far from Donald Trump the first few weeks in office is that sanctions are, of course, a political tool to any U.S. administration, but perhaps more so for Trump. And I think you can specifically see it around the way that Trump, everything that he does foreign policy wise is around a deal, the art of the deal, right? So using sanctions as a leverage tool to achieve his foreign policy aims. And the US has always done that, but I think it's going to be even starker and even more brash than what we've seen before coming out of the US. We've seen what he can do from his first term in office. He pulled the US out of the Iran nuclear agreement and reinstated all US sanctions on Iran pretty much overnight. That was something that was completely misaligned from his European allies. So I think we've seen what he can do in the past. And so we know that he is willing to take those kind of brash and stark decisions. And I think that's only going to continue. And then we also know the people that he's kind of surrounded himself with, right? So his new Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, very critical on things like Cuba, has strong views on China. So it kind of sets the scene up quite nicely for quite a punchy sanctions agenda, which is a continuation of what we've already seen from the US, from the Biden administration going all the way back to like the Obama administrations, but just a little bit amped up. And then I also think sanctions are going to be tied much more to Trump's domestic agenda. So this whole, for example, the designation of Mexican drug cartels, sort of using sanctions as a tool to kind of link it back to a domestic policy issue, which is the flow of illegal drugs over the US border and illegal immigration, things like that. So the kind of art of the deal internationally, but also tying it back to a domestic policy agenda, I think will be super, super important. So expect things like Cuba, Venezuela, Iran, those type of sanctions to harden in the future, I think. And then on China, we already talked a little bit about export controls. I think on China, we're likely to see this continued bleed between sanctions and export controls, of restrictions on China's military industrial companies, placing restrictions on investments and flows of funds short of actual sanctions, but using that more and more in a creative way. I mean, on Russia, I don't even know what's going to happen. We could very well get to the end of this year and it's exactly the same, or we could have a deal in the next few weeks. I think that's unlikely, but I just don't want to predict anything there because literally anything could happen.
But Trump is the first pro-crypto president, and we already saw the US court has overturned the sanctions against the Tornado Cash cryptocurrency mixing protocol. Nicole, is crypto considered a big player in Sanctions circumvention?
Definitely a player. And I think it's important to look at some of the recent cases. I think in December, OFAC designated TGR, which was a group that was systematically money laundering for Russian sanctions circumvention through digital assets. So they used US-backed stablecoins and were involved in kind of the placing, layering, and integration of the evasion proceeds into the financial world. I think what's really interesting about this case is that you see crypto as just one tool in the arsenal for laundering of the proceeds of circumvention. So we know that it's occurring through crypto. It's definitely going to be a challenge to regulate it in that space, especially with the Trump administration. But I also just want to highlight that I think sanction circumvention is occurring through your bread and butter professional enablers of money laundering. So I think we need to be focused on both, but definitely better intelligence sharing is going to be very important in order to bring, blockchain experts, crypto, financial crime experts together with FIUs to be able to identify in both worlds.
And if we also take a look at Syria going forward, following the collapse of the Assad regime, the EU is now considering lifting sanctions in a variety of sectors, but the EU also wants to keep some leverage. But how do you kind of move from this high sanctions approach to not, when the country is potentially still a bit politically unstable? And also it's are you sanctioning the regime or the country in a sense? I don't know how you guys are thinking about the sanctions in Syria now.
I think I'm feeling hopeful that we can get to a place where the people of Syria have the financial channels available to them to rebuild their country. We've seen indications of the sanctions lifting that is anticipated, both from the EU, but also the US issued a new General License 24, which was really focusing on allowing humanitarian remittance payments and allowing certain transactions with Syria governing institutions now when there's been a change in who rules Syria. So this kind of staged approach is so far at least, very humanitarian concerns being front and center, and I hope that continues. But of course, we've also seen what's happened with many other countries which come out of heavy sanctions. Going back to the Iran deal, which we mentioned a little bit before, it was very impossible to decouple sanctions from other types of financial crime concerns. So even as sanctions were lifted, or at least there was some relief from sanctions on Iran, a lot of financial institutions had sort of remaining concerns about wider financial crime concerns, things like transparency into the financial system, how much they can kind of operate within Iran was a bit uncertain ground. And of course, the kind of threat of any snapback of sanctions will always hang over financial institutions. It's not, Nicole can speak to this much better than I can, but it takes a lot of will and investment and thought to re-engage with a country like this. So financial institutions will only do that if they have the assurance that sanctions will be lifted, not just in the short term, but in the long term. So we really need to see that long-term roadmap for opening up those financial channels for Syria. But I feel hopeful that that's where we can get to. And the initial indications suggest that that's the direction of travel, at least for now.
I would agree with Emil. I think especially your point around other types of concerns that financial institutions have in relation to countries where there's been a lot of terror financing and terrorist activity. So the institutions in Syria have been so denigrated for so many years that one of the main ways that funds get into the country are through Hawala networks. And we know that is a way that there's also a lot of financing of different terrorist groups. And so I think that we do need to see this kind of collaboration between removing some of the sanctions, or at least having more targeted, careful sanctions on specific individuals, specific groups, aligning with human rights goals, but also a very keen push by the UN as well to produce kind of a body of evidence of the funds not being used illicitly in order to support the risk assessments that are made within banks.
Yeah, but I read a story this weekend that a lot of brand new Swedish trucks had ended up in Syria, and how all of these enablers across Sweden had been able to get them in there. And just like that is products that are produced really close to home, our neighboring country, and just ending up there. But we have time for one final question before we move on to the Q&A section. We want to hear your spiciest predictions for the sanctions space in 2025.
I think Emil said it best earlier. Whatever we deem spicy, Trump will make spicier. I think the last few weeks have been, honestly speaking, quite shocking when it comes to kind of brandishing the sanctions tool as in such a coercive way. I think when you look at Colombia, for example, and kind of threatening of sanctions, as well as some of the conversations that are happening with Mexico and Canada, although it's more in the tariff space, but it's still unclear. Tariff export controls and sanctions are starting to have these like weird blurred lines that are quite hard for companies especially to manage. And then also with the EU, the divergence or possible divergence, we don't know yet, between the EU and the US and their geopolitical aims, I think is going to be quite challenging for sanctions implementation.
Yeah, just following on from that, with Russia, the US really needs to ensure that it has its European allies in agreement here, because any deal that does not fall in Ukraine's favor will not be acceptable to the EU or the UK. And then we could really end up with a divergence in sanction strategies between the US and its European allies. And I think that's incredibly risky territory to move into. But I think, my spiciest prediction perhaps is that we will finish the year exactly as we started it, which I think is spicy because with Trump, you just never know what's going to happen. So actually the kind of spicy prediction would be nothing at all changes. Russia sanctions will still be where they are now, heavy sanctions pressure, maintenance of those packages, and we'll see the US use sanctions in exactly the countries where we expected to use sanctions. That's maybe my spiciest prediction. And then maybe, hopefully, we'll see a large enforcement from OFSI, the Office of Financial Sanctions Implementation in the UK. Finally, it's taken a few years. I think we've got an enforcement coming soon. It's at least the communications we're getting. It would be great to see a large enforcement because I think they are out there.
And Robin, before you take over and run the Q&A section, do you have a spicy take?
Well, I guess it's not a spicy prediction, but I think an interesting thought experiment is if we were to see a kind of a new Black Swan event and Russia actually redacted from Ukraine and we no longer have a conflict, then I think the interesting aspect is what's happened with the operational aspect of sanctions in between. Because obviously all of these regulated banks, financial institutions have been forced into a new way of dealing with this. And I think like the operational efficiencies that's been gained must be a huge benefit once we get to the hopeful point in time that we no longer have a conflict. A lot of these sanctions are lifted. But will we then go back to just this being a checkbox exercise and then we deal with all of the false positives from Middle East? Or will we actually see a new way of dealing with sanctions as an intelligence perspective? We have better technology and we can find new ways of distributing this workforce and actually keep the operational gains from what we've been working on the last 3 years.
We're going to take a quick break and be back with you shortly. Hey, Stockholm! The laundry is in town. The podcast connecting AML, compliance and financial crime to the real world is coming to Penningtvättsdagarna, Sweden's biggest event for the latest insights on money laundering and terrorist financing. Join us for a live podcast recording on March 12th in the bar, where we will be diving into a very hot topic. If everyone is an AI agent,
what's left for humans?
We will be joined by special guests and be bringing this spicy discussion to a live audience. Don't miss out. Want to attend? Grab tickets for you and your team to join us at the Stockholm waterfront on March 12th and 13th. We'll also be hanging out at the Strise booth, so please do come and say hi.
Hi.
Find tickets links in the show notes or visit penningtvättsdagarna.se for more information. Vi träffas! We got a lot of Q&A questions throughout the episode. So we want to open up the floor to the audience to ask questions to the panelists and share their thoughts on the current situation. So I believe there are now some lined up questions.
Yes. First up, we have, is it even possible to implement sanctions regulations if it's such a losing battle?
I think that we don't have another option. I think it's important to remember the reason that we have these sanctions packages, right? I mean, it's the security, both physical and economic, of the EU that we're talking about. And so I think we have an obligation, both as financial institutions, but also businesses, governments, even regular people, to try to make these as effective as possible.
And I would challenge if it even is a losing battle. Sanctions are having their desired effect because there's such heavy efforts to evade them. Sanctions evasion is a costly affair, and you wouldn't want to evade sanctions if they weren't working. So I would disagree with the premise of the question.
Okay, let's move on to the next one. Should regulatory bodies clarify their guidance and support for firms navigating this complex sanctions landscape, including guidance on sanctions risk assessments? The sanctions are fast-paced, changing environment, but I think there isn't much guidance for those who want to do the right thing.
Absolutely. This is music to my ears. And this is also why I'm discussing so much about the possibility of perhaps UNLA taking up the subject, as it is so crucial for European security. I think we definitely need that. I mean, just an example, in one, I won't name which, but in one Nordic country, there's 10 national competent authorities for sanctions. I mean, to determine where you're sending information to right now is incredibly complex. And we need more streamlined ability to share intelligence with the government and to prevent a lot of the goods reaching Russia. We don't just want to punish companies whose goods reach Russia, we want to prevent it. And that's through communication and conversations and a lot of education. And I think we can only do that through better intelligence sharing and kind of creating better frameworks around sanctions.
Great answer. And I'll jump to the next one. How can you trust that your sanction data provider is giving you the most real-time information?
The question that we all want to know the answer to. That's right. So, I mean, you've got the names of people who are sanctioned. They will be names of people who are on the OFAC list, on the OFSI list, on the EU list. But the list that we probably really care about is the kind of ownership and control. And that's where we are becoming more and more dependent on third-party data list providers who are doing that research into, okay, so if company A is designated, who is actually owning and controlling, or what are the subsidiaries of those companies, and can we map out that structure? Because often it's shocking how little information sometimes is contained in the sanctions listing. And some governments, again, I won't call out specific governments here, but some governments will designate a company and know exactly what their subsidiaries are, or know exactly what foreign branches that they have, but won't put those on the sanctions list. So you are, to an extent, reliant on data provided by others, your own research, your own due diligence, and it is quite a complex affair. And I think that goes back to Nicole's point here. We really need more data sharing, more proactive outreach by designating authorities to provide that information up front, because that's going to help financial institutions comply.
Yeah, maybe an interesting aspect of this as well is the responsibility on you as a regulated entity. You have a responsibility for what kind of systems and data providers you're purchasing from. And I think the quality control that goes into that is a very interesting aspect of this. So you really need to be on top of your data lineage and your data provenance when it comes to purchasing solutions for this as well. Next one. What about countries outside the UK and EU? Is there any urgency or focus in areas like the BRICS countries? And why is this just a Western Europe and UK issue?
I mean, it's definitely not just a UK and EU issue. Actually, quite recently, you had on your podcast someone who's speaking specifically about circumvention and saying, it's quite profitable for these third countries to facilitate evasion. I think we're going to need enforcement action, of course, but diplomacy plays a big role here. Why has the EU and the US implemented these sanctions packages? What is the goal? What is the aim of these packages? And how can we encourage third countries to oblige with them as much as possible, right? But I think there's a huge financial incentive for third countries that feel distanced to the war to facilitate this kind of evasion. And there needs to be both a carrot and a stick method to bring them back into the space of influence, basically, from the West.
Let's go a bit back to the Trump administration. Do you think anything will really change under the Trump administration? Were President Trump's sanctions threats not effective in that Colombia to avoid them? And they agreed to accept the return of its citizens who were illegally in the US.
So I think we're conflating sanctions and tariffs a little bit here. And while I do agree that we're going to see the greater use of both, and maybe sometimes in conjunction, the specific issue with Colombia, I think, was more about trade tariffs as opposed to sanctions. Sanctions were mentioned, but not really what specifically it was going to include. And actually, I think we're all a bit unclear what exactly happened in that scenario. Maybe just following on from what Nicole said, sanctions evasion and kind of ensuring that sanctions are working is all about building consensus, and not just building consensus amongst the EU, UK, and US, but getting other countries on board. And I think a really bad strategy to build consensus is to start threatening things like trade tariffs to countries around the world. I think you need to build consensus and allyship in a different way.
For someone trying to learn more about sanctions in general, what one source or the best source of information would you point someone towards?
One source is very hard. I think anyone who's in the sanctions space needs to be reading the news. I think that's important. Geopolitics is driving sanctions, and so you have to be aware of what's happening and read as much analyses as you can about what's happening. Otherwise, as Emil mentioned, there's a lot of third-party providers who are looking into control and ownership that are very interesting and have intelligence briefings. I'm thinking of Perrin, for example, which has quite a lot of information as to FIs, for example, need to be paying attention to and who are tracking different ownership and control issues.
And I'd say for EU institutions in particular, if you haven't already read the recent guidance put out by the European Banking Authority on screening standards, you should read that now, because it's the first time where we've sort of seen a common set of criteria for what firms should be thinking about when it comes to their sanction screening systems, through to kind of conducting a risk exposure assessment, through to calibrating the tool, through to resolving alerts and determining control and ownership and stuff. So that kind of common standard across the EU is only going to continue, and the EBA guidance is the first step that we're going to see there, and I would encourage everyone to read it. And then, of course, also we've got lots of interesting resources at FINTRAIL that are freely available if anyone would like them.
Great. And apart from the obvious, listen to the Laundry podcast.
Yeah.
To round
we
it
need
off,
to plug ourselves there.
Yeah, we actually have a question from one of our listeners, Matt Stanley. Matt's question is, he'd like enforcement agencies to use laws bilaterally to prosecute and confiscate sanctioned frozen assets potentially gained illegally. How well are we looking at risk holistically, and are enforcement agency hindered by professional enablers, i.e. lawyers, because of their role in prosecutions?
So there's a difference between seizing and freezing assets, and you can't always seize frozen assets, because sometimes the point of sanctions is that they're frozen to induce the target who's had their assets frozen to change their behavior. So that's a longer debate, and there's lots of research being done on this, and there are initiatives to start handing over some frozen assets to Ukraine through various mechanisms. I won't get into that now. It's interesting research that's going on and very, very worthwhile. And then in terms of collaboration between enforcement agencies, So, for example, OFSI in the UK and OFAC in the US recently completed a memorandum of understanding on information sharing, for example. So we're seeing the UK and the US at least starting to share a lot more information around sanctions investigations and sanctions enforcement. And I think that's only going to increase in future.
I'll just add that I think, as Emil said, there's quite a difference between seizure and freezing. However, there's increasing, discussion and kind of theoretical and legal discussion around what to do with the estimated $330 billion in Russian sovereign assets that are currently immobilized globally. And these funds, they really could serve as loans or grants to Ukraine. And I really think, what poetic justice is there than Russian assets rebuilding Ukraine?
Is there one more question at the end here?
Yes, I guess we can take that last question as well. What are the key KYC red flags financial institutions should watch for in 2025? And how have emerging risks such as AI-driven fraud, cryptocurrency transactions, and sanctions evasions changed the landscape?
Like a lot of questions in one. But
let's take the KYC red flags.
Yeah, KYC red flags. I think Emil mentioned them earlier. You really want to be understanding the businesses that are your customers. You want to understand what industry they're in and particularly what goods they're exporting. If those goods are part of the common high priority list. And if you don't know about that common high priority list, look it up. It's the EU and the US prioritizing for us how to tackle sanctions and circumvention from a risk-based approach. It's also understanding the counterparties with which the customers are transacting. Have they been newly created? What's their ownership like? Have they done regular business with your customer in the past? Or has it been kind of new activity? Were the customers involved in the Russian market prior to the war and have not seen a massive reduction in their income since the war began and have started doing more business with third countries that are kind of known transshipment points? So those are just some of the red flags that are important in the KYC process.
That brings the spin of the laundry to an end. Robin, Emil, Nicole, thank you so much for joining me. Where can people find and connect with you?
LinkedIn for me. Feel free to add me, Nicole López Carril on LinkedIn.
Yeah, LinkedIn as well. I should be discoverable on there. And if not, my email is emil.dall@fintrail.com.
And Robin?
Yeah, by now I should probably change my LinkedIn handle. So I'm just LinkedIn/sanctions man. I'm going to try to get that done.
Money makes a world go round.
And thanks to everyone from the community who joined this recording and those who asked questions. Next time, I hope to see you all up on screen asking the questions yourself, but give yourself a round of applause. And if you would like the chance to join another recording of The Laundry and ask questions, then keep an eye out on the All Laundry channels. We will let you know when the next one is. And last but not least, thanks to everyone who is listening to this podcast. If you've enjoyed this episode, go check out the back catalog of more than 100 episodes and follow The Laundry on your podcast platform of choice. We would love for you to share the podcast on your social media channels, tell your colleagues about it, give us a 5-star rating, put it in a group chat. It really helps people find us. And if you have any subjects that you think we should be talking about, comment on the Strise LinkedIn page, my LinkedIn page, or email us at laundry.ai. Your host for this episode was me, Marit. Our producer was Matthew, our editor was Dominic, and our engineer was Nicholas. And The Laundry is a podcast proudly produced by Strise, the AML automation cloud. See you next time.
I'm just going to get some water for Marit and Frederick.
And Frederick, yes. Please get some water for Frederick since he's not here.
The Laundry is proudly produced by Strise, the AML automation cloud.